1970s started what was called the Vietnamization program. And that is turning over the combat operations to the ARVNs. So that was a very popular thing because now we started seeing us backing away and changing the responsibility for that war to the ARVNs, South Vietnamese. They weren't a very effective fighting force, the ARVNs, but it was the beginning. In 1968 and 1974, Nixon administration initiated Paris peace talks. It went on for 5 years. So we kept talking, Henry Kissinger, U.S. Secretary of State at the time, and Lee Duc Tho, North Vietnamese Communist Foreign Minister, were at the table, and we're getting nowhere. So finally, well, I shouldn't say finally, as a result of that, June 1973, a couple of things happened. Well, the Pentagon Papers were published. McNamara, who was Defense Secretary, had a study done of the Vietnam War from 1945 to 1967 and our involvement. A lot of it had been denied. You know, we weren't there in those years. But Daniel Ellsberg in the New York Times exposed that Congress was misled as well as the American public. We were involved. Then in May through October 1972, Nixon decided, well, they're not very serious about ending this war, so let's resume the bombing of the North. Well, that went over like a screen door in a submarine. August 1972, Nixon resigned as a result of the Watergate break-in. So now we have a new administration coming in with Gerald Ford. Now we need to talk about what initiated the final end of the Vietnam War for the U.S. January of 1973, the Paris peace talks finally came to an accord, and they signed an agreement. I'll talk more about that in the next slide. Also, what also happened is 591 Vietnam POWs returned to the U.S. And on March 29, 1973, U.S. troop withdrawals were completed, so we were out of Vietnam. That particular date now is recognized as the National Vietnam War Veterans Day, occurring on every March 29th. We just had that, about a month ago. So let's talk about the details of the Paris peace agreement. So U.S. direct military involvement in this 20-year conflict between North and South Vietnam ended on January 27, 1973, with the signing of that document. That date was established by President Obama in 2012 as Vietnam War Veterans Day. Those talks, like I said, went on for 5 years. The treaty was negotiated by that same team, Henry Kissinger and Lee Duc Tho. That agreement had 7 points. First, we were to withdraw U.S. and foreign troops from Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia. Second, the return of all prisoners of war in 60 days. Third, clearing of North Vietnam ports of mines by the U.S., which we did. That was mainly Haiphong Harbor, by the way. Reunification of Vietnam peacefully without foreign interference. And they established an independent joint commission to control and supervise this whole process. And a ban on further war materials in South Vietnam by the North Vietnamese. That didn't work. And the main reason that didn't work is when this agreement was signed, it was agreed that all territory that had been taken by the North Vietnamese in South Vietnam, they would remain in place. Those troops would remain in place. But no more materials were supposed to be coming in, and they were coming in droves down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And they had a ban on further military personnel into South Vietnam by the North Vietnamese. Well, we know that didn't happen either. So the Paris Peace Accord was violated on those, especially those last 2 points. Okay, what I want to lead to now is that, as I told you, that should have been the end of the Vietnam War. However, the official Vietnam War ending date, as we know, is April 30th, 1975. So, let's see a video clip to find out what actually happened to result in that official date.
Today in the Daily Dose, the Spring Offensive of 1975. Known in the Communist North as the Ho Chi Minh Campaign, the People's Army of Vietnam, or PAVN, began their spring offensive into the South on March the 10th, 1975, capturing the key central highland city of Buôn Ma Thuột by March 18th in a preemptive push south in advance of a second offensive planned for early 1976. Instead, American and South Vietnamese military leaders quickly ascertained that they were no longer capable of defending the entirety of South Vietnam, leading to a pullback from the Central Highlands that caused civilian refugees to come under fire as they fled a lone highway toward the coast. From a combatant standpoint, a well-led and aggressive PAVN took advantage of the South's failing command and control, leading to the all-out rout and destruction of the majority of South Vietnamese forces in the highlands. In response to the pullback and rout, the United States sat on their hands. As the South's Army of the Republic of Vietnam, or ARVN, devolved into a disorderly and panicked withdrawal, they abandoned Kon Tum and Pleiku as they fled deeper south, leading the North Vietnamese to press their attack from the west and the north, capturing Quang Tri, Hue, and Da Nang in a rapid succession of coastal offensives. Caught off guard by the ARVN's unexpected collapse, North Vietnamese military leaders transferred the bulk of its northern troops more than 350 miles to the south in an all-out push to win the war in time for a posthumous celebration of Ho Chi Minh's birthday. In response, splintered South Vietnamese forces regrouped in defense of the capital, despite a near total collapse of political and military will from top South Vietnamese leaders. After North Vietnamese forces captured Tan Son Nhut Airport on April 28th, a day later, the order came down to evacuate American nationals and South Vietnamese sympathizers, who were airlifted from the walled American embassy compound to the American aircraft carriers Hancock and Midway, waiting some 40 miles offshore, ferried by a dedicated task force of some 80 American helicopters. On April 30th, as the last U.S. Marines took to the rooftop of the embassy in hopes of their own Hail Mary evacuation, North Vietnamese tanks and troop carriers stormed into the city, leading to the fall of Saigon and a long overdue end to the Vietnam War.
That was my helicopter, by the way,
And then-
right? I flew that 46, not that particular 46, but that was the helicopter I flew in Vietnam. Okay, so March 1975, air evacuation of Tan Son Nhut, more than 50,000 Americans and civilians and at-risk Vietnamese managed to escape before the airport was bombed on April 28th. By the next day, 150,000 NVA troops were advancing towards Saigon, poised to take control of the city. At 10:51 a.m. on April 29th, Ambassador Graham Martin gave orders to commence Operation Frequent Wind. This was a helicopter evacuation of American civilians and South Vietnamese from the Defense Attaché Office compound adjacent to the airport, as well as a staff of embassy in downtown Saigon. Loading zones were created in the embassy parking lot and on the rooftops. Thousands of South Vietnamese men and women and children crowded the streets and embassy and were in desperate attempt to escape. The military portion of that evacuation was called Embassy Snatch, by the way. You heard frequent wind, and that was the embassy term for the evacuation. But Embassy Snatch was the military code name. So now let's take another look at a video, and it further explains the US Embassy evacuation.
I was the first one into the embassy, and my only mission at this time, this is early in the afternoon, was to bring the ambassador out. It was actually a mission, it was called Embassy Snatch. I was just supposed to get the ambassador. I land and I said to the people, I said, I'm here to get the ambassador. Well, not quite. So they loaded some Vietnamese on my helicopter. And because I'm supposed to have the ambassador on board, we go right to the command ship, the USS Blue Ridge. We land on the Blue Ridge. General Kerry comes out, wants to know where the ambassador is. He said, well, he didn't get on. I mean, I don't know who I'm supposed to tell, but I told everybody I was supposed to get the ambassador, but the ambassador didn't get on. So that starts the lift. Like I say, we had 75 Marine Corps helicopters. Junior wingman would fly into the embassy, get your passengers loaded, and fly back out to the ships. It was a little over an hour back and forth. You're very tired, and you're not seeing the end of this thing. So I got the word out, you know, we could use some help out here. We only have 75 helicopters. And the word comes back, no, Marine pilots don't get tired.
We don't?
About 4 in the morning, 4:30, I land on the USS Blue Ridge again. So General Kerry comes out and gives me an apple and a cup of coffee or something, and he says, we're under orders from the president. You got to get the ambassador out. So we fly in. I land on the roof exactly at 4:50 in the morning. I said, I'm not leaving until the ambassador's on board. So the ambassador's on board. And out we go. We land on the Blue Ridge. 15 or 20, maybe 25 people get off with the ambassador, and that was the end of it. I flew 18.3 hours straight through. We could still be flying if we hadn't got the ambassador out.
Okay, the evacuation of the embassy in Saigon happened without resistance. The NVA did not stop that process. It took place without opposition. There were 80 helicopters because there were some other helicopters from, I forget the organization, Air America, that in fact even helped. 7,000 Americans, South Vietnamese and foreign nationals were taken to safety out of winning ships on the Vietnamese coast in less than 24 hours. An interesting fact is the ambassador initially refused to leave, as you heard. President Ford could have ordered him out directly. Henry Kissinger, his direct boss, could have ordered him out. The generals or admirals in charge of the operations could have suggested he leave. Instead, he was ordered out by a 30-year-old Marine helicopter pilot. Somebody had to do it. And since he had refused to leave until that last flight, piloted by Captain Jerry Berry, who insisted he leave. Personal note, Jerry Berry retired after 25 years as a pilot and colonel in the Marines. He now lives in Vero Beach, Florida. He was born in Anaconda, Montana in 1968, a graduate of Simpson College in Iowa, and commissioned as a Marine Second Lieutenant in January of 1968. You wonder why I researched this particular person's role in the evacuation so thoroughly. Let me tell you. Jerry's first tour in Vietnam was a CH-46 combat troop carrying helicopter pilot with Marine Helicopter Squadron HMM 364 in 1969 and 1970. That was my squadron. I was there then. I was a new pilot in that same squadron in that period. I flew combat missions with Jerry. Quite a few times, and he's a good guy and a great pilot. In 1975, a few years after I left the Marine Corps in 1972, I saw a documentary, the one you just heard, about the airlift in the Saigon Embassy. And to my surprise, I recognized Jerry as he was being interviewed and lauded for his tireless efforts and bravery. Now let's pick up where we left off. The embassy safety, the ambassador was safety aboard the ship. 2 missions, frequent wind and embassy snatch, were considered complete. MACV, Military Assistance Command in Vietnam, said, we are done. We're out of Vietnam. But were we all out? Let's hear the rest of the story in the next video.
Others. But this CH-46 has more than 11,000 air hours and a special place in history.
This one here was the last aircraft out of Vietnam back in April 30th, 1975 during Operation Frequent Wind. This aircraft picked up the Marine Guard off the U.S. Embassy building in Saigon.
When most people think of the last helicopter out of Saigon, this is the image that comes to mind.
Actually, that famous picture you see really isn't the U.S. Embassy. That is an apartment complex down the street from the U.S. Embassy called the Pittman Apartment Complex. And that housed the CIA, a lot of CIA folks, and it also housed folks from USAID. And that aircraft was an Air America Huey that had landed on that rooftop to take out some folks. So that's, a lot of people get confused thinking that was the U.S. Embassy. That really wasn't the embassy.
Back at the embassy, the big CH-53 helicopters, along with the CH-46s, were ferrying people away from Saigon. There were a number of landing zones in and around the embassy complex. The one on the left is where the Marine Guards waited for their ride. The problem was a misunderstanding left them without a helicopter.
The aircraft that took the ambassador, U.S. ambassador out, Graham Martin, was another H-46, just like this one. It was 154803, which is in San Diego, the Flying Leatherneck Museum in San Diego. Took the ambassador out at about 0500 in the morning on April 30th. And the guard was left behind, and when 154803, which was call sign was Lady Ace 09, took off, it sent out a code message that said the Tiger is out. And all the other aircraft in the area thought that meant that the mission was complete, and they all left and went back to their ships, leaving the Marine Guard on the roof of the Chancery building.
On the roof that day was Corporal John Gillian. We spoke with him from his home in Massachusetts.
I'll never forget Major Keene saying, gentlemen, you know, we all joined the Marine Corps, we're all going to die like Marines. This could be our Alamo. And we all just looked at one another like, oh boy.
Eventually, the Marines were able to let someone know that they were still on the roof at the embassy. That's where the helicopter, call sign Swift 22, enters into history.
Later on, there was another H-46 that was on a search mission for another aircraft that had gone down due to mechanical failure, and it was dispatched to the U.S. Embassy to pick up the Marine Guard off the roof of the Chancery building. They got the Marine Guard out around 0753 in the morning and flew to the USS Okinawa, and that was the last aircraft out of Vietnam.
This photo was taken inside Swift 22 not long after it lifted off the roof of the embassy. The evacuation of Saigon was historic because it marked the end of the Vietnam War, but it also has another footnote in aviation history.
It was the largest helicopter evacuation effort in history, and from the embassy that day, the Marine Corps evacuated 985 Americans and 1,100 Vietnamese and foreign nationals from the embassy grounds that day, which was pretty significant.
Swift 22's time in the desert is limited. A museum is currently negotiating to have her restored so the public can get a look at the last plane out.
So on April 30th, 1975, South Vietnam was now in the hands of the North Vietnamese communists and would be reunified as one country. The last video further explains that process.
While the Paris Agreement brought an end to years of bitter warfare between the United States and North Vietnam, it did not bring peace to South Vietnam. Under the January 27th Accords, North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces were permitted to stay in South Vietnam and consolidate the territory they controlled. Although an International Control Commission had been set up to enforce the ceasefire, it was unable and unwilling to stop the fighting that continued to erupt between the communists and the American-backed government of South Vietnam. By March 1975, 2 years and 2 months after the signing of the Paris Peace Agreement, the South Vietnamese army was in full retreat before a superior communist force. By April, Saigon, the capital, was surrounded. President Chu, Premier Key, and other high-ranking military and government officials fled the country. On April 29th and 30th, the United States evacuated all remaining Americans, as well as some 120,000 South Vietnamese, to ships waiting off the coast of Vietnam. As the last American helicopter lifted off from the roof of the American embassy, North Vietnamese tanks rolled through the city and onto the grounds of the presidential palace. A year later, on July 2nd, 1976, North and South Vietnam were finally unified. Saigon became Ho Chi Minh City, and Hanoi became the capital of the new Socialist Republic of Vietnam. South Vietnam, as a nation struggling toward democracy, as a battlefield of American foreign policy, ceased to exist, and the Vietnam War passed into history.
Okay, what I'd like to do now is share with you the ending outcomes in human terms. I probably covered this. Ending outcome, 20-year bomb, you guys. Okay, it fell to the communists, I already talked about that. Oh, human terms, here we go. 2.7 million American men and women served in Vietnam during that 20-year period. U.S. suffered 58,220 KIA, 706 POWs, and 1,241 MIAs, missing in action, still unaccounted for. 97,000 VC and NVA were killed, and over 3 million civilians killed or wounded. What did we learn from this? We went into Iraq after this and Afghanistan, and we're in Afghanistan for a long period of time as well. Anyway, next I'd like to share with you some post-Vietnam associated events that I've been honored to participate in. First one was on August 5th, 2015. The Marine CH-46 helicopter was retired in Chantilly, Virginia, at the Smithsonian Institute of Modern Military Museum. That specific helicopter, while work was being done to add to the Museum of the Marine Corps in Quantico, where it is now permanently displayed. As part of this event, flight logs from Vietnam were made available to pilots who were attending, and we were told that we could look at the flight log to see if in fact we had flown that particular helicopter that went into the museum. Much to my amazement and delight, my name was on that list. It's a great honor to be part of that permanent display. Next, in November, Veterans History Project came to USM, as Sarah had mentioned. There were representatives from Washington, D.C. touring the country, and they had asked if they could interview people from Vietnam and we would share our experiences. They said that if accepted, if the interview was accepted, it would be put into the Library of Congress as a permanent record and to be made available for listening for anybody who was interested. I volunteered, and my interview was accepted and is now archived in the Library of Congress. I'm extremely proud of that accomplishment. Next, on November 10th, 2020, which was the 245th anniversary of the Marine Corps, we had a 50th reunion of Vietnam CH-46 squadrons in Hilton Head, South Carolina. My squadron, HMN 364, was well represented. I reunited with many of my former squadron mates, most of whom I hadn't seen since 1970. That included the co-pilot I was involved in a crash in Vietnam, and that included that co-pilot who was flying the aircraft at the time. We always took turns flying. He was still harboring guilt after all these years, 50 years, and was hesitant to approach me. Since I was the hack, I was in charge of the aircraft. He was harboring guilt feelings, and he had left the Marine Corps and went to medical school and became a doctor. And he was still harboring all of those guilt feelings for all those years. I consoled him and by saying that it was an accident. I did not blame him nor resent him. As the hack, the safety of the aircraft and crew were my responsibility. He was very relieved, and we had a good time talking thereafter. It was truly a pleasure to spend time with all of them, sharing our memories, getting caught up in our lives, and enjoying a camaraderie of that 3-day event. And finally, today is the latest honor, because it is cathartic for me to share all of this information with you. And I thank you for that. So I'd like to open it up for questions, comments. Anybody have anything they'd like to ask?
You were flying out of Pleiku,
Da Nang,
Da Nang,
flying out of Da Nang. Yeah.
with missions to where?
All over I-Corps. We covered I-Corps. Pleiku was in the 2nd Corps. Mostly Army personnel were flying into Pleiku. Now, Khe Sanh, a year before I got there, we flew many, many, many missions there. Lost a lot of aircraft and a lot of people because they were being steadily bombed for months. So that was a Marine Corps area. Chretien up north, right next to the DMZ, was another place that suffered a lot of heavy bombing and, not bombing, I should say, artillery. And that was all part of our area.
You talk about heavy bombing. That comes from B-52s.
Yes, yes, they used to have strike flights with B-52s in the north and along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. How they all continue to strive and survive is beyond me, because that's pretty devastating.
Yes.
I mean, we could feel the earth shake when the
One B-52 had 105 500-pound general purpose bombs. So you can imagine several B-52s coming by.
yeah, it's awesome, absolutely awesome. Yes, Tom.
I had a friend who flew those B-52s over the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and his experience was he never saw a face. But years later, he harbored a lot of guilt over that whole common campaign. But that's not my question. My question is, how dangerous were these flights? How many helicopters, how many crew did you lose during your time there, I guess?
The question is, how dangerous were these flights and how many crews did we lose while I was in Vietnam? Our squadron, there were 3 CH-46 squadrons in Da Nang where I was. Our squadron, we only lost 2 while I was there. Lost a full crew in one of them when they, the weather was terrible there, especially during monsoon season, and they ran into a mountain. Lost the aircraft and the whole crew. And then a couple of months after that, I'd been in country maybe 2 months. We lost a pilot, a very senior pilot, who was killed and died immediately. A bullet in the eye. And then, although he wasn't in my squadron, I had a very good friend that I went to flight school with. His 3rd month in country, on a troop insert, was shot and killed a few days later. And he was a fabulous guy. Interesting side note about that is before we left the States to go to Vietnam, we were talking as a group, guys, a group of pilots, and he said, I'm gonna buy my sister a stereo equipment before I leave. And we looked at him and said, Marty, why would you do that? You're going to Asia, where is the best place to buy inexpensive stereo equipment, especially in Hong Kong. I said, why don't you wait till you go over there? He said, no, I want my sister to have it before I leave. Reflecting back on that, my thought is that he had a premonition. He knew he wasn't coming back. And within 3 months of being in Nam, he was killed. He was 23 years old. Yes.
I have one little comment, and it's for the audience. All of you have heard about the Vietnam Memorial in Washington, D.C. I would recommend, if you want to see a real Vietnam Memorial that's user-friendly, go to Fall River, Mass. They have one that you can see the names without having to be up close to stare at it. The lettering is in white on the black monuments. And you don't have to go downhill, it's all flat. It is a very beautiful monument. It's a 2/3 scale. I happened to be there several years ago when they were starting the construction, and I actually spoke to the engineer of the monument. By accident, we went to see some lights at La Salette, and the gentleman that I was with, that I served with in Vietnam, his wife asked us bystander to take our picture. And he introduced himself as, I am the engineer of that monument. So it was meant to be there. So
Yeah.
I recommend, it's not a trip all the way to Washington DC, it's just Fall River, Mass.
Yeah, they also have
It's
a traveling,
beautiful monument.
they also have a traveling wall that goes around every year. It's coming again, I think, to Orchard.
Oh, yes, I had seen that one,
Yeah.
and that is a beautiful one.
Yeah.
But the one at Fall River, Mass also has all the monuments.
Because my wife Artis and I went to Washington DC, and I took a rubbing of Marty Benson's name on the wall.
That's all. Thank you all.
Thank you very much.